the Arab revolutions, where massive outpour of articles, at least in the news, but also again in academic writings, really had a start and end point, focusing on Facebook and the internet. And what is interesting is that in this narrative, there is this very classic problem of a message being lost in translation. Now, obviously, you can't expect from all the reporters to suddenly be native speakers. And even those who've been using stringers on the ground in the Arab world haven't been able to sort of get the idea across that was being expressed on the ground. But for instance, this poster, this picture has been reproduced a lot in articles and websites. And for me, it expresses this problem of a meaning that is very complex, getting lost in translation, because it's basically what you see if you're non-Arab is Facebook. Our optical focus is basically very selective. We select what we see based on what our brains understand and know. We don't even actually see the Arabic if you don't focus on it. I would have the same with English or Arabic in the context of Mandarin or other writings. So you don't see that it says Shukran Shabab Masr Facebook. Thank you to the youth of Egypt. And then you can say who use Facebook, or who are on Facebook, or who are known as Facebook. What you see is Facebook. And maybe you can distinguish the first word. Like someone would say, oh, it says Shukran. And then the conclusion is, oh, Shukran Facebook. So there's this fascinating phenomena where things are selected out because they just don't fit a certain framework, or narrative, or discourse, or linguistic baggage. And there were this series of photos of Egypt with this garage that was also replicated in many articles. I've started just clicking and looking and trying to find like who else reproduces the same picture. And it's not all the same picture. So it's really interesting to know that somehow photographers found this and thought it was nice, and then we just went to the same place. Like the photographer would just go to the same place, like different photographers would just find this interesting. And why? Because I guess also it sort of brings it all together, right? This old, archaic kind of thing, like a garage, dirty door, the, sand, stones, kind of the Egypt of the past, pre-modernity. And then the modern awakening, the spring, with Facebook as its label. And then if you see the centerpiece in the middle, was the basic photo, which was cut in many other photos. It is a zoom out, and then you see that it's actually Facebook, Al Jazeera in Arabic, Twitter and other things. So Jazeera is just as well mentioned on those graffitis as Facebook. But again, Jazeera is lost in translation. You don't write Jazeera in English. You write it in Arabic, but you do write Facebook in English. There's no Arabic equivalent. So again, it's lost in translation. It's the kind of codes we decode and encode the meaning of social media on the ground through also our abilities, or lack of abilities. Which is not just a criticism, because, what do you expect? This kind of stuff was produced in no time, in a matter of weeks and months. All these analyses were coming out of a region that most journalists don't know much about, have not done any work on. You can hardly blame them for actually being so limited. But it is a fact that it is very much, not only visibly, but also politically present in the revolutions, the internet. But I cannot discuss the role of the internet anymore in a celebration manner. I used to write in the first and second year a lot about how activists used the internet secretly and how it was related to their offline mobilizations, but very much still in the notion of a happy celebratory mood. I think that we can all agree that 3 years after the fall of Ben Ali and Mubarak, the revolutions do remain a symbol of political protest, an immense human sacrifice. But eventually, the worry about where these revolutions are going have superseded the celebratory mood. And this worry, you hear that, you read that between the lines of a new generation of articles coming out now, a new style of discourse that is coming out about the role of the internet and media in the Middle East. I mean, just think about the size of, we've seen the Tahrir Square, and then think about the size of a crowd of tens of thousands of people on Tahrir Square, the third anniversary last year, cheering the Minister of Defense, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Just think of that bizarre contradiction of 3 years later, the same site, almost the same number of people, but actually cheering for the general, actually cheering for our Arab version of Pinochet. Or think about images of historical sites like Aleppo that are not existing anymore, that have turned into ashes. Those images are mind-blowing, and they are also confirming to us that a counter-revolution is in full swing, that we cannot discuss anymore the Arab revolutions or the Arab Spring without discussing the counter-revolutions. And if we do, then it's pure theoretical academic exercise that is not related to grounded realities. So we have arrived, I think, to a sort of post-social media hype moment now. I think the end of 2013 and 2014 will be remembered as the beginning of that post-social media hype moment in history. As Tatiana Rezinova, who I met in Berlin last month at the Biennale, she put it really nicely. She said that the technological practices that were treasures are actually turning into trash. She's saying that this digital trash that we're seeing occurring now is hovering between the margins of revolution and counter-revolution. So we're moving from a liberal kind of anxiety over free speech and resistance through counterculture to getting acquainted with a very dominant digital culture that is morphed into this kind of smooth mukhabarat, surveillance, and cyber warfare methods. I showed you the logo of the Syrian Electronic Army. The Syrian army has its own electronic department that does this very thing, that produces this digital trash to monitor, to send viruses, to surveil, to check friends' networks in order to trace activists and arrest them, and torture them. So as the dust has settled, as we often say, we see this sort of much clearer vision of how the gatekeepers of the old regimes are crawling back and now reclaiming the same online spaces that we thought were the spaces of the activists, were mainly the possession of revolutionaries. So we are in this kind of in-between state now, which is why I said in the beginning, I can't talk in terms of past tense, future tense. We are really in this in-between state, between this trash and treasure, which inhibits certain warnings about the dangers and threats, but nevertheless, I would say, it also calls upon us to resist the tendency to throw away our nostalgia and to just replace our nostalgia with defeatism, which is a trend that we've also seen a lot of people falling into, to basically retrospectively declare the revolutions lost or even never happened in the first place, you know. Some would go as far as saying they were just applauds, actually, from the first day. They were not revolutions, people revolt. We should be very wary of that, to not throw away the baby with the bathwater. When we say that there's a counter-revolution, it also means there still is a revolution, within and without the online spaces produced by the internet. So there are major issues we need to grapple with. A lot of these issues that are shaped by the revolutions that I am interested in and work with are very much related to technological developments. And the first thing that is really interesting, that we still have not found methodological ways to deal with, there's massive debate now, by the way, between different sections of the social sciences to debate the value of data analysis and what online data means. Because these technological changes have intensely changed also the media ecology that we work with. So, for instance, Naomi Sacker wrote about how this hampers the quality of communicating news and informing the world, because there are many worrying trends of fake journalism. That's sort of the other side of this digital revolution, is that it's very hard now to agree on what is proper data, what is empirical and what is not. Are images representing realities, or are images in a digital era by default to be questioned because of the ease with which you can manipulate it? So there are all these debates going on at the moment between journalists and internet researchers. But secondly, also, I think more important here is that there are contradicting results with which we have to account for. The first 2 years, this debate, this topic was very much about how activists were helped to mobilize and create a narrative and a discourse for themselves on these platforms in cyberspace. But now we have to also be brave enough to apply this analysis in a context of counter-revolution and say, well, how does it apply to the aims and motives of regimes or counter-revolutionaries? So what I try to do to make that work is to deconstruct the role of the internet, and to basically look at examples of counter-revolutionary internet practices. And this ties neatly back to my first part of media empire and capitalism. Because what does it mean when the state actually owns the infrastructure and has direct access to these telecom companies? It means, for instance, like this text message from the armed forces in Egypt, that they can, in one go, one click, one decision, message the whole country and Egypt has above 100% mobile penetration rate, by the way, above 100, so some people have 2 mobile phones. So the regime or the army can, in one go, mobilize or sell their narrative to the public by enforcing these companies or these infrastructure to mediate their message. The regimes can also just decide that it's important to cut the lines. In Syria, this happened, I think, in May last year. Is it May? I don't know if it's so. I think this was May last year during one of the terrible attacks. I think it was Ghouta. chemical attack in the neighborhood. It could be that or it could be Homs. I'm not sure. But and they decided basically to cut the lines for a number of hours, or I think even a whole day, to prevent news coming out and footage being sent abroad. So we need to account for those changes and flip our analysis. But one of the ways I find works a lot is to deconstruct the internet also in different phases. So when we talk about revolution, we need to also specify what we mean. When we talk about the internet, we need to specify what we mean. Do we mean the internet only as a tool? Just a tool to mobilize someone, to tell someone where to meet, or a tool to design a flyer? Or do we mean the internet as a space, a site of contestation, where we actually debate certain dominant narratives and where we argue with one another and try to construct a common analysis? And in this sort of matrix also, we've reached now the sort of third phase, the post-revolution phase. And I really see very clear differences in the way the internet is applied as a space and a tool compared to the pre-phase. In the pre-phase, where you still have to do everything in your power to mobilize, to get the numbers on the street. That's the most important thing, to get numbers on the street. In that sense, the role of the internet has an important promise, because particularly for a certain demographic section of society who is online and who uses social media, it's a very good way to reach them. But in a post-stage, where we are shaped by escalation and violence, you can't stop violence by debating about it online. So you see, this actually helps me when I get confused with really traumatic examples, for instance, from Syria, to basically take a step back and deconstruct the role of the internet accordingly. This brings me to my last point, where I want to end, in a more sort of boring conceptual contribution. And that is how to understand this, this link between internet activists or activists and media. Because we know that the most important crystallization in 2011 was the moment that mainstream media adopted the narratives and the demands of the activists. The most well-known example, of course, is Al Jazeera. When Al Jazeera started actually showing the protests as they were, it imposed on the rest of the mass media a narrative and a discourse and an image.